In the early 3rd century before the Common Era in Athens, there was a porch. It ran along the north side of the agora, the civic center of the city, and its walls were covered with painted scenes of famous battles, the Greeks at Marathon, the heroes of the Trojan War, warriors rendered in such detail that a person walking slowly past them could spend an hour reading their faces. The porch was called the Stoa Poikila, the painted porch, and sometime around 300 BCE, a man named Zeno had begun teaching there, drawing a small group of students away from the painted walls and into a conversation that would continue in one form or another for the next 5 centuries. Zeno had come from Citium, a city on the island of Cyprus, and he had arrived in Athens by a route that was not by any standard planned. A shipwreck near the Athenian port of Piraeus had washed him ashore with his cargo of purple dye, ruined, and his previous life as a merchant effectively ended. He had wandered into a bookseller's stall, read a passage from Xenophon's account of Socrates, and asked the bookseller where he might find a man like the one described. The bookseller had pointed to Crates the cynic, walking past in the street at that moment. Zeno had followed him. Years of apprenticeship followed, then years of refining and questioning and building until Zeno was teaching his own students under the colonnade of the Stoa Poikile, the painted battles watching over the edges of their conversations. On a particular morning, unhurried, like most mornings under that porch, the light coming in from the open side in long, pale angles, Zeno drew in the air with his fingers a kind of grid, 4 boxes, 2 axes, and he began to explain to the students gathered around him something that no one had quite formulated in this way before, that the disturbing emotions, the ones that make a person's life turbulent and difficult, do not arise from the body, or from fate, or from the gods, but from a small number of specific errors in judgment, each of which can be identified, examined, and in principle corrected. The grid was simple. On one axis, present or future. On the other, believed to be good or believed to be bad. A present thing, believed to be good, produced pleasure. A future thing believed to be good produced a desire. A present thing believed to be bad produced distress. A future thing believed to be bad produced fear. 4 disturbances, 4 mistakes, all of them, Zeno told his students, arising not from the world pressing itself upon the passive soul, but from the soul's own active, assenting response to what the world appeared to offer or threaten. Anger sat within this grid with particular precision. To be angry was to be in the presence of something believed to be bad, an insult, an injury, a wrong done, and to have added to that belief a second one, that retaliation was not only appropriate, but required. The double structure mattered. The first belief was a judgment about value. The second was a judgment about what must follow. Remove either one, and the anger could not take its shape. This was not a comfortable observation to sit with, especially not on an ordinary morning when someone had been genuinely unkind, when something genuinely unfair had occurred. But Zeno was not offering comfort in the ordinary sense. He was offering something more durable than comfort, the possibility of seeing clearly. Athens in that period was not a city conducive to equanimity. The great era of Athenian democracy had ended with defeat in the Peloponnesian War more than a century earlier. The city existed now under the political shadow of Macedonian power. The agora, where philosophers debated and citizens argued and merchants sold and generals planned, was a place of noise, competition, hierarchy, insult, and occasional violence. Zeno had not chosen to teach in a garden, as Epicurus would do, sequestered from the city's difficulties. He had chosen the porch that opened directly onto the public square. His philosophy was meant to be tested against actual life, against the actual press of people, against the actual experience of being a human being in the company of other human beings who would regularly disappoint, obstruct, and provoke. The four passions Zeno enumerated, pleasure, desire, distress, and fear, were not simply categories. They were, in the Stoic understanding, disturbances of the rational soul. The Greek word was pathe. It is sometimes translated as passions, sometimes as affections, sometimes as disturbances or perturbations, and each translation captures something the others miss. The word pathe comes from the same root as what happens, from pathos, suffering, undergoing, being acted upon. To be in a pathos was to be in a state in which the soul had, in some sense, been acted upon by something outside itself, rather than acting from its own rational nature. The soul had been moved, and the direction of that movement, in Zeno's account, was always away from the truth about what was genuinely valuable and what was not. This is what made anger for the Stoics not merely unpleasant, but philosophically mistaken, not regrettable, not understandable, but unfortunate. Mistaken in the precise sense that it rested on beliefs that, carefully examined, turned out not to be true. Anger insists that something genuinely valuable has been damaged or lost, or that something genuinely bad has been done. This insistence feels authoritative. It feels like perception, like simply seeing what is there. But Zeno's grid held the question open. What exactly is genuinely valuable? What genuinely can be lost? These were not rhetorical deflections. They were the actual questions that Stoic philosophy had been built to address, and the answers it gave were specific and strange enough to require sitting with for some time before their implications became felt. The Stoics held that only virtue, the condition of the rational soul, operating as it properly should, in accordance with logos, with reason, with the deep rational structure of the universe, was genuinely good, and only its absence, vice, was genuinely bad. Everything else, health, reputation, property, the good opinion of others, bodily comfort, social standing, the affection of friends, fell into the vast middle category that the Stoics called the indifferents. Not bad, most of them. Some of them were preferred, and a reasonable person would arrange their life to include them where possible. But none of them were the good itself. None of them were the thing whose loss constituted a genuine harm to the self. This was the foundation on which the Stoic account of anger rested, and it was a foundation that required the whole weight of Stoic cosmology and ethics beneath it to stand. The point was not simply that material losses were less important than we tend to think, though that was part of it. The point was that the rational self, the part of a person that judges and chooses and cares and wonders, the part that is genuinely theirs and genuinely them, is not reachable by the things that anger is typically about. Someone has insulted a reputation. The reputation belongs to the category of indifference. Someone has damaged property. The property belongs to the category of indifference. Someone has obstructed ambitions, or taken credit, or been unjust, or simply been difficult and unkind. All of this lands on the surface of the indifferent world, and anger, which treats these events as genuine harms to the genuine self, has misidentified the target. It has assigned the wrong value to the wrong things. It is, in the precise Stoic sense, a judgment that does not track the truth. The students under the Stoa Poikeo listened to this, and some of them, no doubt, found it immediately clarifying. Some of them found it implausible. Some of them probably sat with it in silence for a while, working through the cases they knew from their own lives, the specific injustices, the specific losses, the specific moments when anger had seemed not only reasonable, but obligatory, and testing the Stoic claim against them with the careful attention Zeno's teaching was designed to cultivate. Chrysippus, who would become one of the most important figures in the Stoic tradition, was not yet born when Zeno was teaching at the Stoa Poikil. He would come later, would become the third head of the Stoic school after Cleanthes, would write an enormous number of books, most of them now lost, and would refine and systematize Stoic philosophy with a precision and argumentative force that would shape everything that followed. By his time, the school Zeno had founded had been thinking about the pathe, the disturbing passions, for 2 generations, and the questions had become more precise. One of those questions concerned the soul itself. The dominant tradition before the Stoics, running through Plato and with roots deeper than Plato, had divided the soul into parts, a rational part and an irrational part, or, in some formulations, several parts at different levels of reason and appetite. This division had the intuitive appeal of explaining what everyone had experienced, the sensation of knowing the right thing and yet wanting the wrong thing, of feeling the pull of appetite or anger or fear in a direction one's deliberate reason opposed. Plato had compared it to a charioteer driving 2 horses, one noble and cooperative, one wild and resistant. The struggle was structural, built into the soul itself. Chrysippus pressed his stylus against his wax tablet and drew a different picture. The soul, he argued, was not divided. The disturbing passions, including anger, were not upwellings from a separate irrational faculty that the rational part had somehow to contain or override. They were cases of reason itself going wrong. The whole soul was rational in its nature. When it was disturbed by a path, what had happened was not that the irrational part had overwhelmed the rational part, but that reason itself had made a bad judgment, had assented to a false belief about value, and in assenting had set itself moving too fast, too far, in a direction that overshot its proper function. Chrysippus reached for an image. Imagine a person walking. He suggested walking at a normal pace, upright, with a destination and a reasonable stride. Now imagine that the person has begun, without fully deciding, to walk faster and faster until they are running. And because the body in running has committed to a momentum that the mind has not fully governed, it cannot simply stop cleanly when it decides to stop. It stumbles. It overshoots. It arrives somewhere it did not quite intend to arrive. This was his image for the pathos, not a separate horse pulling in a different direction, but reason itself, running too fast, overshooting, arriving at a judgment that had moved beyond what the evidence warranted and what wisdom would have counseled. The anger was not separate from thought. It was thought having run beyond its proper pace. This distinction mattered, and it mattered not only as a technical point in the debate between Stoic and Platonic psychology. It mattered because of what it implied for the possibility of change. If the passions arose from a separate irrational faculty, then the rational self was always in a certain sense at war with a part of itself it had not chosen and could not fundamentally alter. It could discipline and suppress. It could hope to keep the worse part contained by the better. But the irrational part would always be there, requiring constant vigilance, ready to break through. The Stoic picture, with its single rational soul that had merely run too fast, implied something different, that what had gone wrong was in principle fully correctable by reason itself, because reason was the only faculty at work. The error was inside the process that could examine and correct it. The angry person was not at war with part of themselves. They were a single person who had made a mistake, and mistakes of judgment are the kind of thing that can be addressed by looking more carefully at what one has judged. Beneath the painted battles of the Stoipoikale, this was the work Zeno had been trying to begin. A student who had heard these ideas and returned home to an ordinary life, an ordinary household with ordinary domestic friction, an ordinary marketplace with its ordinary disappointments, the ordinary experience of being at the wrong end of someone else's contempt or unfairness, would eventually, in some quiet moment, after some particular flare of anger, sit down and try to trace the sequence backward. The heat had been real. The feeling of having been wronged had been real, in the sense that the feeling was fully present and fully vivid. But the Stoic question was not whether the feeling was real, it was whether the judgment beneath the feeling was true. The sequence went, something happened, an impression arrived, an image, a perception, a report of what had occurred. Before the anger, there had been that impression, and before the anger fully solidified, there had been a moment, brief, easy to miss, but in principle detectable, in which the soul had assented to a judgment. This is genuinely bad. This has genuinely harmed me. Retaliation is genuinely appropriate. The assent was the hinge, not the impression itself, which arrived uninvited and unchosen, but the assent to the judgment, the impression proposed. This was where the mistake was made. This was where reason had begun to run too fast. Sitting with this sequence, the student might discover something unexpected. Beneath the heat of the anger, there was a belief. The belief was about value, that something genuinely important had been damaged, that a genuine harm had been done to something that genuinely mattered. And the Stoic question, pressed gently against that belief, was, is this true? Not is the feeling understandable, not is the provocation real, but is the underlying judgment about value actually tracking what is valuable? This was not a rhetorical trick. The Stoics were not trying to persuade anyone that nothing mattered or that harm did not exist. They were trying to locate where the genuine locus of value was and to examine whether the anger had correctly identified it. In most cases, the insult to reputation, the slight to social standing, the material loss, the obstruction of plans, the examination would reveal that what had been treated as a genuine harm to the genuine self was in fact a disturbance to the surface of the indifferent world, real in its way, annoying in its way, occasionally genuinely difficult and requiring practical address, but not a harm to the thing that is truly theirs. There is a word for what the Stoics proposed as an alternative to this kind of disturbance. It is eupatheia. The word is sometimes translated as good emotion, or well-reasoned affective state, or simply as the right kind of feeling, and each of these translations gestures towards something that the Stoic account was unusually careful to specify, because the Stoic goal was not, has never been correctly understood as, the elimination of feeling. The sage, the wise person who had fully internalized Stoic principles and was operating from them consistently, was not someone who moved through the world in a state of cool, feelingless appraisal. The sage felt, but what the sage felt was not the same as what the untrained person felt, and the difference was not one of quantity, but of kind. The pathe, the disturbing passions, including anger, rested on false judgments about value. The eupatheia rested on correct ones. Where the pathos of fear was an irrational contraction before a future apparent evil, the eupatheia of caution was a rational concern for genuine goods that deserved protection. Where the pathos of pleasure was an irrational expansion toward a present apparent good that was in fact merely preferred and not genuinely good, the eupatheia of joy was the well-founded sense of satisfaction that accompanied genuine virtue in action. And in the territory of anger, the territory of perceived wrongs and apparent harms, the eupathia was something like righteous resolve or appropriate concern, the measured, well-grounded response of a person who has accurately identified where harm can and cannot land, and whose response arises from that accuracy. The Stoic sage moving through the crowded streets of Athens or Rome, through the ambient press of insults and injustices and small provocations that city life inevitably delivers, was not experiencing nothing. Something in the sage registered the rudeness of the man at the corner, the unfairness of the magistrate's ruling, the unkindness of a passing remark. That registration was real, but it did not become a pathos, did not become the anger that overshoots and commits the soul to motion. It cannot cleanly stop, because the registration had nowhere false to land. The sage knew, with the settled knowledge of long practice and genuine conviction, that none of these things had reached the part of the self that was truly the self's own. What was visible to someone watching, if they knew what to look for, was the steadiness of pace, not the blankness of someone who is suppressing or dissociating or simply not paying attention, but the particular quality of movement that belongs to a person who is fully present to what is happening and is not being moved by it in ways that will cost them their bearings. This was what the stoical was for in Zeno's understanding, not a retreat from the world, but a training within it, a daily rehearsal of seeing accurately, judging well, and responding from a place that had found its proper temperature. The word eupathia itself is worth sitting with for a moment. The prefix eu means good or well, the same prefix that gives the Greek its words for good birth, good city, good death. The binus pathia is from the same root as the pathe, the passions, the states of being acted upon. So eupathia is literally good feeling or well feeling, feeling that has gone well, that has arrived at its proper place, rather than overshooting into turbulence. The Stoics were not naming a coldness, they were naming a warmth that had found its proper temperature. The difference between anger and appropriate concern is not that one feels and the other does not. It is that one has gone too fast, run beyond what the evidence warrants, committed itself to a judgment that does not track the truth, and the other has arrived exactly where the situation, accurately seen, calls it to arrive. The student who paused over the word eupathia in a borrowed text, turning it slowly in their mind as evening came on and the light through the window changed, might have found that it named something they had felt before, in moments they had not known how to describe. Not the absence of feeling, but the particular quality of feeling that comes when care is not entangled with illusion, when concern does not depend on what turns out to be indifferent, when the warmth is real and its object is real, and the proportion between them is true. Zeno had drawn his grid in the air with careful fingers, in the early light under the painted porch, with the scenes of Marathon watching from the wall and the city going on with its daily noise in the square beyond. The grid was simple enough to sketch in a moment, but the work of actually inhabiting it, of tracing the sequence backward from feeling to judgment, of asking whether the belief at the bottom of the anger was actually true, of finding what was genuinely good and what was merely preferred, of learning the difference between a pathos that storms through the soul and an eupathia that holds its proper warmth without burning. That work took a lifetime, and it began with a question asked quietly in the aftermath of some particular flare of heat. What exactly was the belief that made this feeling possible? What exactly had been assumed to be genuinely good, genuinely bad, genuinely at stake? The pathe were not mysterious visitations from outside the soul. They were not the irrational part asserting itself against the rational part's better judgment. They were reason briefly running too fast. And the correction, this was what Zeno had wanted his students to understand, standing in the painted porch with the city all around them. The correction was not the suppression of reason. It was reason looking more carefully at its own motion, checking its pace, returning to the truth about what is genuinely valuable and what is not, which the Stoics understood to be a truth that the rational soul, in its clearest moments, already knew. The pathe and the eupathia, the disturbing passion and the well-grounded affective state. Two different things the soul might feel in the presence of the same event. The difference between them was not the presence or absence of feeling. It was the accuracy of the judgment that each one rested on. This was what the early Stoics had built their account of anger on, not a denial of feeling, not a performance of impassivity, but the patient philosophical claim that how we feel is always, in some measurable way, a function of what we believe, and that what we believe can be examined and sometimes corrected, and that the examination itself, the slow tracing back from heat to judgment, from judgment to belief, from belief to the question of whether it is true, is the beginning of a particular kind of peace. Not the peace of someone who feels less, the peace of someone who, having looked carefully at what there is to feel about, finds that the proportion between their response and the actual situation has come into a truer alignment, a warmth that does not burn, a concern that does not overwhelm, a response to the world that has found, through the patient work of examining what is genuinely good and what is merely preferred, something closer to the temperature it was always reaching for. In the Stoa Poikile, under the painted porch, in the early light of a 3rd century morning in Athens, this was what was beginning. Not a finished doctrine, not a set of prescriptions to follow without examination, but a way of asking, carefully, without urgency, with the patience of someone who has decided that seeing clearly matters more than feeling justified, whether the belief at the bottom of the disturbance is actually true. The question, once genuinely asked, changed the shape of what followed. Not all at once, but steadily and without return. The pathos storms through the soul, moves it in directions that overshoot what the evidence warrants, and leaves the person in a position they did not quite intend to reach. The eupathia holds its ground. It feels fully, from a place that has found its proper anchor in what is genuinely valuable, and in holding, it offers the soul not emptiness, but the particular quality of stillness that belongs to something which knows, with quiet and examined confidence, exactly where it stands. This was the distinction Zeno had been drawing toward in the painted porch, with the careful fingers of a man who had come from Citium by shipwreck and had found, in the ruins of one life, the material for a different kind of philosophy. A philosophy that did not ask people to stop caring, that asked them instead to care from a more accurate and therefore more peaceful place. The difference was not the warmth, but the temperature, not the feeling, but the truth of what the feeling rested on. And that truth, patiently examined, was available to anyone willing to trace the sequence back from the heat to the judgment, and from the judgment to the question that the Stoics had decided mattered most. What, in all of this, is genuinely yours to lose? Seneca held the 3 rolled manuscripts in his hands and read the first sentence back to himself. He was in Rome, probably in the early evening, in the years after his return from Corsica, where 8 years of exile had given him time to think about many things, and anger, he had decided, was among the most urgent. The 3 books now resting against his palms had been addressed to his brother Novatus, and they had taken the form of a sustained, almost relentless examination of a single emotion. He read the opening line again. Fornestric ira furor brevis. Estimated asterisk anger is a brief madness. He set the manuscripts down and considered whether, sitting here in this room, in this body, with this particular history, he actually believed that about himself. This is where Seneca begins, not with a tidy definition, not with a list of doctrines inherited cleanly from his predecessors, but with a sentence that places the philosopher and the criminal, the senator and the lunatic, on the same ground. The angry man, he writes, loses rational self-governance, his face flushes, his eyes acquire a brightness that is not intelligence. His hands, if not controlled, move ahead of his thinking. And the curious thing, the thing that makes the observation worth sitting with, is that Seneca is not writing about enemies of the state or men of notoriously poor character. He is writing about the person one was this morning at breakfast when the slave dropped a dish or the letter arrived with the wrong news. Madness in the ancient world was understood as the loss of the rational faculty, the capacity to govern one's own responses, to examine an impression before acting on it, to keep the chain of cause and effect from running its full length unchecked. What Seneca is claiming in that compressed opening sentence is that anger replicates this loss exactly, not permanently, and perhaps not completely, but for its duration, for the brief hot span in which it holds the soul. The angry man and the madman are, in the ways that matter philosophically, the same kind of thing. The parallel is meant to disturb a little, and Seneca knows it. He is writing for educated men, men of the Roman governing class, men who would find it insulting and absurd to be compared to the clinically insane. This is precisely why the comparison works. It arrives before the defenses are up. It names something that has been felt but not acknowledged, the way a surge of anger carries a person somewhere they did not intend to go, somewhere they sometimes cannot fully account for afterward. And by naming it with that particular clinical precision, it opens a question that the rest of the 3 books will spend a long time answering. Seneca wrote asterisk de ira asterisk across 3 books, and the structure of the 3 is itself a kind of argument. The first book makes the foundational claim and defends it against the most obvious objection. Surely, someone will say, anger is sometimes useful. Surely the righteous indignation of a general or a judge accomplishes things that calm reasoning cannot. Seneca takes this objection seriously. He does not wave it away, but he works through it carefully, marshaling cases and counter-arguments until the ground beneath it begins to soften, and the book ends with the conclusion that anger, whatever it appears to accomplish, accomplishes those things by accident and at an unnecessary cost, the way a man who knocks down a wall with his head might be said to have achieved something, though the wall could have been opened with a key. The second book moves into causes. Where does anger come from, and what are the conditions under which it is most likely to form? The third book turns practical, moving from the diagnosis toward the daily work of remedy. And it closes with something that gives it a weight. The first 2 books do not quite have an extended reflection on forgiveness and the cultivation of gentleness that makes the whole project feel less like a program for becoming better and more like a philosophy for becoming slowly less at war with the world one actually lives in. Across all 3 books, one biographical shadow moves behind the arguments, visible to anyone who knows where to look. Seneca had served at the courts of emperors. He had been close to power, which in the Rome of his era meant being close to rage, the institutional, unchecked rage of men who had no limit on their authority, and therefore nothing to prevent their anger from becoming policy. Caligula had ordered executions on the basis of an afternoon's irritation. Sulla had prescribed men who had done nothing more than inconvenience him. The pattern Seneca traces in the private soul, the judgment that one has been wronged, the assent to the belief that retaliation is appropriate, the action taken before the belief has been examined. This pattern does not grow smaller when the person who assents to it commands armies. It grows, instead, to the exact scale of the power available to it. Seneca writes about these emperors not as a distant historian assembling cautionary tales, but as a man who had sat in those rooms and watched the dynamic move from an irritable comment to a sentence of death with a speed that left no time for intervention. He is not performing outrage. He is bearing witness with the particular cold precision of someone who has decided that understanding the mechanism is more useful than recording its horror. The angry emperor is not a monster in Seneca's account. He is the angry man with no external limit, and the external limit Seneca's entire project suggests is always the wrong remedy anyway. The only limit that holds is the internal one. The only correction that cannot be overridden by circumstance is the correction of judgment itself. There is a morning practice Seneca describes and returns to across the 3 books, and it has a quality that is easy to misread on first encounter. He calls it a preparation, a deliberate running through of the provocations and frustrations and minor humiliations that the coming day is likely to contain, not because the day will necessarily be terrible, and not out of pessimism, but out of a specific philosophical insight about the relationship between surprise and anger. Anger, Seneca observes, is most often amplified by shock. The man who expected to be treated well and was not is angrier than the man who had prepared himself for the possibility of poor treatment, not because the second man cares less, but because the element of shock has been removed, and with it the additional heat that shock contributes to the reaction. The kindling, as Seneca puts it, was not there to catch. The match arrived and found nothing waiting for it. So the practice looks like this. In the early morning, before the day's business begins, the Senecan philosopher sits quietly and considers what is likely to come: traffic in the streets that will be slow and jostling, a colleague who has a habit of lateness, a letter that may bring unwelcome news, a meal that may disappoint, small frictions accumulated across hours that will by evening feel more significant than any of them individually deserved. He runs through these, not with dread. This is the part the practice requires some care to hold correctly, but with the attentive calm of someone preparing for known conditions. A man setting out to sea checks the ropes and the weather not because he expects catastrophe, but because the sea is the sea, and preparation is simply the appropriate response to what is real. The practice is, in this way, the opposite of pessimism. It does not make the day worse in advance. It removes the expectation that the day will be smooth, which is the expectation that, when violated, as it regularly is, transforms ordinary frustration into something closer to betrayal. And it is betrayal, the feeling that something one was owed has been withheld, that produces the particular heat anger runs on. Take away the false entitlement, the philosophical error of expecting a world organized around one's own comfort, and the fuel becomes harder to light. Seneca is exact about the scope of this practice. He is not asking for the surrender of all preference, or the cultivation of an indifference so comprehensive that nothing in the day registers as unwelcome. He is asking for the replacement of one kind of expectation with another, the naive expectation of a world without friction, replaced by the honest expectation of a world that will have some, and the equally honest expectation that the philosopher who has prepared for this will navigate it with more grace than the philosopher who has not. There is something companionable about this, read across 2,000 years. Seneca writes about it in the first person. He makes it clear that the practice is his, that he has used it, that it has helped him and has sometimes failed him, and that the failure is also part of the record. He is not describing a technique he has mastered and is now transmitting from a position of achieved equanimity. He is describing something he is still working on, which is visible in the texture of the writing, the way it circles back, returns to the same ground from a slightly different angle, tests the argument against a new case, as though the philosopher is not so much explaining a solution as continuing the inquiry in the presence of the reader. And this is what makes asterisk de ho, era asterisk, feel different from a philosophical treatise, in the formal sense, different from a series of propositions and their proofs. It reads across its 3 books more like a letter, extended, sometimes digressive, earnest in a way that formal philosophy often is not. The reader is not being argued into a position. The reader is being invited into a conversation that the author has been having with himself for a long time, and into the particular quality of attention that such a conversation, sustained long enough, begins to produce. Near the center of the second book, and again more briefly near the end of the third, Seneca turns to what he considers the single most practically effective remedy for anger. Not the morning preparation, though that has its own importance. Not the analysis of anger's causes, though understanding the mechanism helps. The single most practically effective remedy is something smaller, more specific, and harder to describe without making it sound trivial. It is delay. A provocation arrives. Something has been said, something done, something withheld that the philosopher believes he was owed. The first movement of anger, the warmth in the chest, the tightening of the jaw, the sudden focused attention on the person responsible. This movement is, for Seneca, not yet anger in the fullest sense. It is an impression, a first reading of the situation, and it has not yet been assented to. The question is what happens in the moment that follows. If the provocation is met immediately, if the reaction moves directly from impression to expression, from the feeling of having been wronged to the act of retaliation, then the judgment at the center of the anger has never been examined. It has been assumed because assumption is fast and examination is slow, and anger moves at the speed of assumption. But if in that first moment nothing is said and nothing is done, if the philosopher simply waits without drama, without performance, without the self-conscious rigidity of someone making a visible effort to hold themselves back, then something is created that did not exist before, a space, a brief quiet gap between the impression and the response. And in that gap, the rational faculty that anger temporarily displaces has a chance to return to its proper function, not to suppress the anger, not to talk the philosopher out of caring about what happened, but to examine the belief that is sitting at the center of the reaction, the belief that a genuine harm has been done, that the harm was intentional, that something truly valuable has been damaged, and to ask quietly whether these beliefs are actually accurate. Seneca is careful to note that the examination sometimes confirms the anger. There are situations in which a genuine harm has been done, in which the rational assessment of the facts agrees with the initial impression, and in which some form of considered response is appropriate. The Stoic philosopher is not committed to passivity in the face of real injustice. What he is committed to is ensuring that whatever response he makes is governed by his own reasoning rather than by the first hot reading of the situation, which is frequently incomplete and often wrong. What the delay does at its best is restore the question. Before the delay, the judgment feels settled. Something happened. It was bad. The appropriate response is this one. After the delay, the judgment is available for examination again. And available for examination, most of the anger Seneca is concerned with, the anger of daily life, the anger of social friction and minor disrespect, and the accumulated small indignities of living among other people, turns out to rest on beliefs that do not survive scrutiny. The harm was not as significant as it seemed. The intention behind it was not what it appeared to be. The thing that felt damaged was not, in the Stoic accounting, truly valuable in the way that would make its loss a real injury. The image Seneca reaches for when trying to describe what the delay does to anger's chemistry is a physical one. He speaks of the cooling of what was heated. He speaks of the settling of what was stirred. There is something happening in the body as well as in the reasoning, and the two are not entirely separable. The delay that creates space for philosophical examination is also the delay in which the physical state of anger, which is genuinely a kind of fever, has the opportunity to reduce. He is not naive about this. He knows that some angers are too old and too entrenched to cool in a single pause, that there are grievances carried for years, whose heat persists long after the original provocation has been forgotten or distorted. The practical remedy of delay works most reliably on fresh anger, on the immediate reaction to a present provocation, and the deep, more structural angers require something closer to the philosophical work of examining one's fundamental beliefs about what is valuable and what constitutes a real harm. But as a daily practice, as the routine discipline applied to the ordinary encounters of ordinary days, the deliberate pause between provocation and response is in Seneca's considered view as effective and as practically achievable as anything he knows. In a room somewhere in first-century Rome, a senator reads back over Seneca's prescription and tries to remember the last time he had used it. He thinks of the morning meeting, the colleague who had spoken over him, the dismissiveness that had felt, in the moment, like a deliberate slight. He had responded. He had said something sharp and slightly too loud, and he had watched the response land with the satisfaction of the moment and the discomfort of the hour that followed. He considers now what would have happened if, at the moment the dismissiveness arrived, he had simply done nothing, not suppressed the feeling, not performed indifference, simply waited for one breath, for two, and let the impression sit in the open air before deciding what it meant. This is the thought experiment Seneca is always running. Not for other people, not for the distant cases of imperial rage and historical tyranny, though those serve their purpose as evidence for what the pattern looks like when it has no limit, but for this person, in this room, on this ordinary morning, with these ordinary irritations. The philosophy is not for emergencies. It is for the meeting, the letter, the breakfast, the colleague, the missed appointment, and the careless word. Seneca's relationship to his own philosophy has always been complicated, and he is honest about this in a way that is, across the centuries, something like companionable. He had been exiled. He had lived at the margins of imperial power, and then at its center, and the center was not a place that made anger easy to avoid, not because it was cruel, though it sometimes was, but because it was the kind of environment that made the passions run hot simply by virtue of the stakes and the proximity to other people's ambition and fear. He had felt anger. He had almost certainly acted on it in ways he later examined and found wanting. The 3 books of *to era* are not the record of a man who solved the problem and is now sharing the solution. They are the record of a man who is still working the problem, who believes it can be worked, and who is committed to the working, regardless of whether the solution ever arrives in its completed form. There is a passage toward the end of the third book that carries this quality more clearly than any other. Seneca is describing the long-term project of the philosopher's relationship with anger, and he writes with a kind of patience about slowness, about the way change in this domain does not arrive all at once, but accumulates in small increments, each day's practice adding something too small to notice to a total that eventually becomes noticeable. He does not name a threshold. He does not promise a moment of arrival. He describes instead a direction of travel, away from the reactive toward the deliberate, away from the assumption of harm toward the examination of whether harm has actually occurred. This patience is itself a philosophical position. The Stoic who expects to have overcome anger completely by next Tuesday has misunderstood both the project and the philosophy. What is being worked on is not a habit in the simple sense, but a set of deep beliefs about what is valuable, what is truly one's own, and what constitutes a genuine injury to the rational self. These beliefs took years to form, in many cases centuries of cultural accumulation, to install as defaults, and they do not yield to a week of morning preparation and deliberate delay, however faithfully practiced. What they yield to over time is persistent, honest, undramatic examination, the kind of examination that *Dira* itself performs, book by book, page by page, returning to the same territory from new angles until the territory begins to look different than it did. The letter format matters here. Seneca is writing to his brother Novatus, and the voice of someone writing to a specific person who is not a student or an inferior, but a brother, an equal, someone he shares a history with, someone he has probably irritated and been irritated by in the ordinary way of sibling life. This voice has a texture that the formal philosophical treatise does not. He is not above the material. He is in it, writing from inside the experience of having found it difficult, and still finding it difficult, and believing nonetheless that the difficulty is navigable. The belief is not certainty. It is something closer to confidence accumulated from practice, the specific confidence of a person who has tried the deliberate pause enough times to have seen it work, even if he cannot guarantee it will work next time. There is a scene that hovers behind the writing of *Dira*, never stated but always present, and it is this: Seneca, at his writing table, manuscript completed, reading back over the argument from the beginning, pausing at the cases and examples he has assembled, testing the rhetoric against the philosophy against his experience, and arriving at the end of the third book at something that is not quite certainty and not quite doubt, but the practical middle ground between them, the ground from which useful work gets done. He reads the opening sentence again, *Ira furor brevis. Estimated *anger is a brief madness, and he considers, sitting with it now, in the quietness of having written 3 complete books in its examination, whether the claim holds when the madness is his own. He thinks of Caligula, whose rages he had witnessed or heard described at close range. He thinks of the morning preparations he has sometimes made and sometimes failed to make. He thinks of the times the deliberate pause held and the times it did not, and of the difference in the day that followed each. He thinks of Novatus, to whom the books are addressed, reading them somewhere across the city, and he considers what he hopes his brother takes from the project. Not, he decides, a technique, not a method. Something closer to a way of attending to the question of what anger is, what it rests on, and whether the beliefs at its foundation are accurate. Because the answer to that question, followed honestly and without the shortcuts that comfort requires, leads somewhere different than the question would have led if not followed at all. It leads toward the examination of value, toward the recognition that what feels like damage to the self is almost always damage to something the self has borrowed. Reputation, status, the approval of other people, the smooth surface of plans that never survive contact with reality intact, and the recognition, quiet and without drama, that the borrowed things, when seen clearly, are not what the self fundamentally is. The office is quiet. The manuscripts rest on the table. The evening, whatever evening this is, whatever year in Rome, in the middle of the 1st century CE, is doing what evenings do, which is to lengthen the light and soften the edges of things, and make the philosophical question feel, if not simpler, then at least less urgent. There is time to examine the belief. There is time between the provocation and the response to determine whether the provocation actually required a response at all. Seneca picks up the manuscripts again, rolls the third one closed, and sets them in order on the table. The brother will read them. The argument will land where it lands, whether it changes anything in Novatus, whether it changes anything in Seneca himself, whether the deliberate pause he has described in such detail will be available to him the next time the morning goes badly. None of this can be predicted or guaranteed.
What can be done is what has been done. The honest examination, the careful argument, the return again and again to the same ground until the ground is familiar enough to navigate in the dark. That is the pace of it. That is what the 3 books together,
in their long and companionable examination of a single difficult emotion, are actually describing, not the distance between provocation and rage, which is almost no distance at all, but the distance between provocation and assent, which is in principle infinite, and which the philosopher who has practiced long enough can expand into something useful, something navigable, something that looks from the outside like patience and feels from the inside like the return of one's own reasoning to its proper place. The anger comes. The first warmth arrives. The first reading of the situation. The first movement of the body toward response. And then, not dramatically, not with visible effort, but in the way that a practiced thing happens, quietly and without announcement, the philosopher simply does not speak, does not move, waits, watches the edges of the anger, where it meets the air, where it meets the larger question of whether the belief sustaining it is actually true, and feels the cooling begin. Marcus Aurelius picked up his notebook when the lamp was still burning, and the camp outside was quieter than it would be by morning. The tent was made of leather, and the wind came through it, in the way wind comes through any structure that has been standing too long in one place, not violently, but persistently, as a reminder of how much was outside and how thin the walls were. He had spent the day in a chair, not in battle, but in the slower kind of governance that felt some evenings more exhausting than battle would have been. The petitions, the disputes, the men who needed something from him and could not say it plainly, the decisions that had to be made before enough information was available to make them well. He opened the notebook and wrote not for anyone who would ever read it, but because writing was the tool by which the day's accumulations could be examined, and if they held up under examination, released. He had been irritated. This was the first thing he wrote, and he wrote it without softening it, because there was no one to perform equanimity for, and performance had never been the point. He had been irritated, and the irritation had moved through him in the particular way it had been moving through him for years, not as something foreign, but as something familiar and unwelcome, like a guest whose visits he had learned to anticipate, and whose departure he had learned to wait for without making it into a crisis. The irritation had come at midday, in the middle of an arbitration that was taking longer than it should have, because one of the parties had decided that volume was a substitute for argument, and Marcus Aurelius had listened and had made his ruling and had moved on. But here, in the tent, at the notebook, the residue of the irritation was still present, and he was examining it. This is what the meditations are at the level of their daily practice. Not a finished philosophy, but a philosophy being practiced, night after night, on the actual material of a life that kept providing occasions for practice. The text is addressed to no one. It has no audience it is performing for. In its earliest books, Marcus addresses himself in the second person, not warmly, not cruelly, but in the flat, clear voice of a man who has noticed something about himself and does not intend to let it pass without acknowledgement. Stop doing this. Return to yourself. You know what is required. The voice is not the voice of self-punishment. It is the voice of someone who cares about his own philosophical progress, the way a craftsman cares about the quality of his work, not obsessively, but honestly, with the kind of attention that does not pretend a flaw is not there in order to feel better about the piece. The notebooks were written somewhere between the year 170 and the year 180 of the Common Era, and they were written largely on the Danube frontier, where Marcus had been fighting the Marcomannic Wars and managing the slow grinding pressure of a northern border that did not want to hold. He was in his 50s for most of the writing. He had been emperor since his early 40s, had been prepared for the role since he was a child, had trained in philosophy since his teens, and had by any external account the most complete access to resources, advice, and learned companionship that the ancient world could offer. And yet the notebooks return, again and again, to the same difficulties, the same temptation to despise the people around him, the same pull toward irritability when someone fails to live up to what he knows is possible, the same need to remind himself, for the 100th time, in what appears to be slightly embarrassed awareness, that it is the 100th time of the same foundational philosophical truths. This repetition is not a failure. This is what makes the meditations the document it is, and what makes it useful to anyone who has ever tried to live a philosophical principle rather than merely affirm it. The understanding comes easily. The embodiment comes slowly, with repetition, and the repetition does not mean the understanding was wrong. It means that philosophy is not a thing you acquire once and carry forward. It is a practice in the literal sense of the word, something you do, not something you have. The philosophical principle Marcus returned to most consistently when the topic was anger was the concept of the hegemonikon. This is a Greek word that translates roughly as the ruling faculty, the part of the soul that governs, that steers, that is responsible for the quality of all our other mental operations. The Stoics had various ways of describing it. Sometimes they placed it in the chest. Sometimes they described it as the center from which all the soul's activity radiates. Marcus's own way of describing it was characteristically personal and characteristically precise. He came back to it in different books, in different formulations, always circling the same recognition that the hegemonikon cannot be touched by anything external, that whatever happens in the world around it, whatever insults land, whatever goods are lost, whatever people do or fail to do, the ruling faculty of the soul remains, in principle, undisturbed, not because it is absent, not because it has gone numb, but because it is not the kind of thing that external events can reach. The image Marcus used was not always the same, but one version of it was the image of a clear pool. The world comes to its surface, wind, thrown stones, the disturbance of weather, and the surface moves. There is ripple and agitation at the surface, but the depths of the pool, below a certain point, remain still, And the claim Marcus was making was not that the surface does not move. He was honest enough to acknowledge that it moves, that he is moved, that the irritation at midday was real, but that there is a depth to the self that the disturbance never reaches, and that the practice of philosophy is the practice of learning where that depth is and returning to it when the surface becomes turbulent. This is not an easy distinction to make. The anger does not feel like a surface event. When someone has been contemptuous, when a judgment has been overruled by someone with less understanding of the matter, when the person across the arbitration table is substituting volume for argument, the anger that arises in response does not feel like a shallow ripple in a deep pool. It feels central. It feels like a report from the core of the self about something that matters. And Marcus knew this. He was not writing to an imaginary person who had never felt anger. He was writing to himself, who felt it regularly, who knew its texture and its specific psychological flavors: irritability, contempt, the slow corrosive disappointment in people he had expected better from. What the philosophy offered was not the claim that anger is not felt, but the claim that anger, however it is felt, rests on a mistake, and the mistake is always the same mistake, arrived at from the same source. The mistake is the belief that something genuinely valuable has been harmed, that the insult, the injustice, the failure, that these have reached something real, something that belongs to the category of things that matter in the deepest sense. And the Stoic argument, the one Marcus returned to night after night at the notebook, was that they have not, that the body can be harmed, that the reputation can be diminished, that property can be taken and circumstances worsened, but that the hegemonikon, the rational faculty, the part of the self that chooses, that judges, that holds its values and applies them, remains ungoverned by any of this. The harm that anger insists has been done is, by Stoic reasoning, never the harm that has actually been done. Marcus performed as a regular practice an exercise in temporal distancing. It is described in several places in the notebooks, in different forms, always recognizable as the same underlying movement of attention. He would bring to mind the specific person or event that had provoked anger, not abstractly, but concretely, the actual person, the actual afternoon, the actual words that were said, and then, while holding that particular image, he would begin to expand the frame, not dramatically, not with a performance of cosmic indifference, but gradually and with genuine attention. He thought of other emperors. He thought of Alexander, who had conquered more territory than Marcus administered, and who was now nothing but a name, and not a name that everyone remembered, and not a name that, when remembered, carried any of the actual living weight of the man it had once referred to. He thought of the armies, the courts, the ministers, the arbitrations, the meals, the children, the ambitions, all of it gone into the same undifferentiated past. The purpose of this exercise was not to produce indifference. Marcus was careful about this, and the notebooks reflect the care. Indifference is not what the philosophy aims at. The Stoic sage is not someone who has stopped caring about justice, or about the people around him, or about the quality of his own actions. What the temporal distancing exercise produces, practiced honestly, is not indifference to what matters, but proportion, an accurate sense of the scale at which any particular anger is operating relative to the scale at which time and existence actually operate. The person who spoke contemptuously this morning will be gone. The insult itself, the specific words, the specific afternoon, will be gone. The anger in response to them is, by the measure of the time against which Marcus learned to measure things, very small. And in the perspective of something very small, the intensity of the response begins, not through suppression, but through honest appraisal to find its actual proportion. There is a passage in the fifth book of the Meditations that has the quality of someone catching themselves in the middle of something they had promised themselves they would not do, and doing it anyway, and noting it with a rueful accuracy that is both comic and serious at the same time. Marcus writes, essentially, you have woken up complaining again. Stop it. Everything that happens happens according to the nature of things. Return to yourself. The address is to himself, in the second person, in the flat voice of the practice. And what is notable is not the lapse everyone lapses, but the response to it, which is not despair or self-punishment, but simply the resumption of the practice. He notes the failure and picks up the tool and continues. This is what philosophical progress looks like when it is honest about itself, which is nothing like the smooth upward arc that a finished philosophical system implies. The question Marcus returned to when anger arose was a Socratic question, and he knew it was Socratic, and he credited Socrates with it in the notebooks. The question was not the obvious first question that anger wants to ask. Anger wants to ask, how could they do this? The question Marcus substituted for it was, what false belief about what is good has led this person here? The substitution is not rhetorical. It is a genuine philosophical redirect, and it requires a genuine philosophical commitment to make it work, because the anger does not want to be redirected. The anger wants to be agreed with. It wants to sit in the judgment seat and deliver its verdict. And the verdict is always the same. The person who has provoked the anger has done something genuinely wrong, and the anger is the appropriate response to that wrong. And to question either of these propositions is to betray the justice of the case. Marcus questioned both propositions, night after night, from long practice and from deep conviction. He questioned the claim that the wrong was what anger said it was, and he questioned the claim that anger was the appropriate response. But the most persistently interesting of his moves was this Socratic one, the replacement of reactive judgment with philosophical curiosity. Because if the Stoics are right that the only genuine goods are the goods of virtue, and the only genuine evils are the vices that obstruct virtue, then anyone who acts badly toward another person is not acting from malice in the way anger assumes malice. They are acting from a false belief about what is good. They believe that status matters enough to trample someone for it. They believe that their momentary advantage is worth more than the philosophical cost of taking it dishonestly. They believe, in short, that the things the Stoics classify as indifferent, wealth, reputation, social position, the opinions of the crowd, are genuinely worth having at whatever cost their acquisition requires. This is a philosophical mistake. It is the same philosophical mistake that virtually every human being is making, to varying degrees at virtually every moment. It is the mistake Marcus himself was, he knew, also making, in different ways, on different days, in subtler forms than the obvious ones. And from the inside of that recognition, the recognition that the person who has provoked the anger is operating under conditions not so different from the conditions the philosopher himself is trying to transcend, the anger begins to change character. It does not disappear necessarily, but it cannot sustain its full temperature in the presence of genuine understanding. The heat of reactive judgment requires the conviction that the other person is operating from a place fundamentally different from the one the philosopher himself occupies. And the Socratic Stoic move is to examine that conviction and find that it does not hold. This is what Marcus called, in different formulations across the notebooks, recognizing the shared nature. He returned to it in the context of anger more than in any other context. The people who are contemptuous are not a different kind of being from the philosopher who sometimes feels contemptuous impulses and works to examine them. The people who act from false beliefs about what is good are not by their nature different from the philosopher who holds some false beliefs about what is good and is slowly, imperfectly working to replace them with better ones. The difference is in the degree of awareness and the commitment to examination, not in the fundamental human situation. And this recognition, genuinely held, not merely affirmed, has the effect of replacing the specific heat of anger with something that functions more like philosophical concern, not the cold detachment that Stoicism is sometimes accused of, not the indifference of a man who has decided that other people's errors are not his problem, but the particular warmth of someone who recognizes, in a person behaving badly, something of their own unexamined tendencies and feels, instead of contempt, a kind of sober companionship in the shared difficulty of the philosophical project. Marcus wrote in Greek, not Latin, and this is worth noting because it tells something about where he located himself philosophically. He was a Roman emperor writing in the language of the tradition he was trying to live, the Athenian philosophical tradition as it had come to him through his teacher Epictetus, whom he had never met in person, but whose words had been recorded by Arrian and were a persistent presence in the notebooks. The philosophy Marcus practiced was not an ornament. It was the operational system by which he tried to run both the empire and, more importantly, himself. And the running of himself was harder than the running of the empire, which is saying something, because running the empire on the Danube frontier in the 170s was genuinely difficult. The discipline of impulse, the training of the self, not to act from every impulse that arises, but to pause and route the impulse through rational appraisal before it issues in action, is one of the three great Stoic disciplines, and it is the one most directly relevant to anger. The other two, the discipline of desire and the discipline of assent, feed into it and support it. But the discipline of impulse is where anger is most practically engaged, because anger is not only a feeling, but an inclination toward action, toward the sharp word, the retaliatory gesture, the decision made in heat that will cool into something the philosopher would not have chosen in a better moment. The pause between the impulse and the action is where the discipline operates. It is very small, that pause. It can be as brief as a breath, but within it, if the practice has been sustained long enough, the routing happens, the impulse arrives at the appraisal. The appraisal asks the Socratic question, and what emerges from the other side of the question is not suppressed anger, but something that has been genuinely reconsidered and genuinely revised. In the tent on the Danube frontier, by lamplight, in a language that was not the language of the empire he governed, Marcus Aurelius was performing this revision, not on today's anger only, though today's anger was the occasion. He was performing it on the accumulated structure of his responses, the tendencies, the characteristic failures, the places where the same kind of situation produced the same kind of irritation before he could catch it. The notebooks are partly a map of these tendencies, drawn by the person who knew them best, because he was the one who had to live with them. The map is honest and specific, and occasionally embarrassed, and never hopeless. The tone throughout is the tone of someone who finds the work difficult and finds it worth doing anyway, and who has never, it seems, been tempted by the conclusion that because it is difficult, it cannot be done. The view from above, the panoramic perspective Marcus describes in various places, is not only a spatial exercise, it is also a tonal one. When the frame expands to include the full sweep of time and the full scale of the cosmos, the specific personal wound that anger is responding to does not become nothing, but it becomes proportionate, and proportion in Stoic philosophy is very close to wisdom, the person whose responses are calibrated to the actual scale of what has happened, who is disturbed by disturbances in proportion to their genuine significance rather than in proportion to the heat of their subjective impact. That person is approaching what the Stoics described as the well-ordered soul, not perfect, not finished, but moving in the direction of a life that is less governed by the lurching of reactive emotion and more governed by the steady, patient application of rational appraisal to the actual facts of what has happened and what is genuinely at stake. Marcus would not have said he had achieved this. The notebooks make clear that he would not have said anything of the kind. What he would have said, what he did say, in various formulations, is that the practice is worth continuing, that each day provides fresh material for it, that the fresh material is not a discouragement but an opportunity, and that the philosopher who returns to the same lesson for the 100th time has not failed to learn it. He has simply discovered that learning in philosophy is not a destination but a direction. There is something that the meditations give the reader that finished philosophical texts, however brilliant, cannot give in quite the same way. They give the experience of philosophy being practiced, with all the imperfection and repetition and occasional self-exasperation that practice involves. The arguments in the notebooks are not always the most sophisticated Stoic arguments. Marcus was not an original philosopher in the technical sense. He was a practitioner, and what he practiced was the application of established philosophical principles to the actual texture of his daily life. The irritability, the disappointment in people, the temptation to use his position in ways that philosophy told him were wrong, the difficulty of maintaining genuine philosophical attention in the middle of an administrative life that was relentless and demanding and never fully amenable to the kind of quiet that philosophy prefers. The quiet he found was at the notebook. It was the quiet of the evening review, the backward movement through the day that the practice required, not in guilt or in self-punishment, but in the honest attention of someone who cared about the quality of his own rational life, and knew that the caring required looking at what had happened rather than away from it. The anger at midday was real and had to be examined. The contempt that had flickered through him in the morning arbitration was real and had to be examined. The philosophical question behind both of them, what false belief in myself as in the person who provoked me has produced this response, was the question that could not be evaded if the philosophy was to be more than an affirmation. What Marcus found when he examined the anger was almost always the same thing, not always the same occasion, not always the same person or the same specific frustration, but always the same philosophical structure at the bottom of it. The anger was resting on the belief that something genuinely valuable had been touched, that the insult to his reputation, or the contempt of the courtier, or the volume-over argument of the man in the arbitration had damaged something real about him, and the Stoic examination was the examination of that belief. Had something genuinely valuable been touched? Was the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the part of him that chose and judged and held its values, was it actually diminished by any of this? And the honest answer, found through honest philosophical examination rather than through wishful self-consolation, was always no. It had not been touched. It could not be touched by these things. And the anger, resting as it did on the belief that it had been touched, was resting on something that was not there. The anger did not always dissolve immediately on contact with this recognition. Marcus was honest about this too. The philosophical understanding and the felt intensity of the emotion do not always move together in perfect synchronization. The understanding can arrive clearly while the heat is still present, and the heat can linger after the understanding has done its work. But the heat without the philosophical support underneath it is different from the heat that still carries the conviction of its own justification. It is heat that is already cooling, already losing the authority it needs to drive action, already in the process of returning to the proportion that the examination has revealed. This is what the discipline of impulse, practiced long enough, actually produces. Not the absence of heat, but the absence of unconsidered heat. Not the incapacity for anger, but the incapacity for anger that has not been examined. The anger that survives the Socratic question, what false belief is underneath this, is anger that has at least been honest with itself, and anger that has been honest with itself is already doing philosophy rather than merely reacting. The stars outside the tent on the Danube frontier were the same stars that had been there when Zeno had drawn his fourfold grid in the air for his students in Athens. They were the same stars that Epictetus had looked at from a different position and used to make a similar point about the scale of things. Marcus looked at them sometimes, though he does not describe this in the notebooks, but he describes the cosmic perspective often enough that the looking is implied. The vast, indifferent scale of the universe was not for him a source of dread. It was a resource. It was the perspective within which individual provocations found their actual size, and their actual size was always smaller than anger had insisted. Before he closed the notebook, on evenings like this one, Marcus would have moved through the day's anger one more time, not to revisit the wound, but to complete the examination, not to rehearse the wrong that had been done, but to find, underneath it, the false judgment that had generated his response, replace it with a more accurate assessment, and allow the revision to settle. The evening was for this. The notebook was for this. The practice was not beautiful, and was not always easy, but it was honest, and the honesty was what gave it its particular quality of peace, not the peace of a man who has decided that nothing matters, but the peace of a man who has decided that most of the things anger insists are catastrophic are under examination, not catastrophic at all. He closed the notebook. The lamp continued to burn. Outside, the Danube moved in the dark, carrying its cold water from the mountains toward the sea, indifferent to the tent and the emperor and the notebook and the anger that had been examined, and gently, incrementally released. The lamp gave its light without effort, as it had been giving it all evening, as it would continue to give it until the oil was gone. And the question that had occupied the notebook, what false belief, in me as in everyone, is underneath the anger, continued, where questions of that kind always continue, past the end of the day, and into whatever comes next, open and unfinished, and no longer urgent, resting in the particular way that honest philosophical work tends to rest, without needing to be held. The recognition that other people err from false beliefs rather than from malice is not a comfortable recognition in the moment. It does not feel immediately like relief. In the moment, it feels like a kind of resistance. The anger still wants its verdict, still wants the simple structure of wrongdoer and wronged that would make the response straightforward. What the Socratic question does is complicate that structure, honestly and without comfort, until it no longer supports the weight of the anger that rested on it. And in the space that opens up when the structure gives way, what arrives is not indifference and not distance, but something closer to the specific sorrow of recognizing a shared condition. The philosopher and the person who has provoked him, both of them operating within the limits of what their current philosophical understanding allows, both of them capable of more than this, both of them imperfect practitioners of the difficult project of living with some relationship to what is actually true. Marcus Aurelius spent 39 years trying to live this. The notebooks record 39 years of trying and returning, of the same failures, approached with the same instruments, and the same quiet refusal to conclude that because the failures recurred, the instruments were useless. He did not, by any honest reading of the text, achieve the equanimity of the Stoic sage, the ideal figure who moves through the world's provocations without being moved by them. What he achieved and what the notebooks document is something more useful, the steady practice of a man who was genuinely moved, genuinely irritated, genuinely tempted by contempt and reactive judgment, and who returned each time with genuine philosophical attention to the examination that was the only cure the tradition offered, and found it, each time, enough to continue. The anger at midday had been real. The examination in the evening had been honest. The notebook had been closed, and in the closing of it, not in triumph, not in resolution, but in the quiet completion of the day's philosophical work, there was the particular quality of stillness that Marcus returned to. Night after night, not as a reward, but as the natural resting place of a mind that had done what it could with what the day had given it, and was now, without effort, letting the rest go. Epictetus is standing at the front of a room in Nicopolis, a city on the western coast of Greece, in the early years of the 2nd century of the Common Era. He is not young. The classroom is plain, stone walls, simple benches, the kind of room that makes no promises about its contents. The students in front of him are young men, mostly the sons of Roman equestrians, who have come some distance to sit in this particular room and listen to this particular man. He lets the silence settle for a moment. Then he asks them a question. "What is the one thing," he says, "that no one and nothing can ever take from you?" He waits. The question is not rhetorical. He genuinely wants to see where they reach. Some of them reach for obvious things, health, perhaps, or the love of family, or the accomplishments of the mind. He listens to each answer with the attention of a man who has already turned this question over so many times that he knows every wrong answer by its particular texture, and then, when the silence has stretched long enough, he gives them the answer he has been carrying since long before he stood in any classroom. The one thing that cannot be taken is the faculty of choice, the capacity to meet what happens and decide from the inside how to receive it, not the power to change what the world does, the power to govern how the self responds. This, he tells them, is what philosophy is for, not consolation, not the decoration of a comfortable life. The actual, operative, daily exercise of a faculty that remains sovereign, regardless of what the world brings against it. The students write it down. Some of them understand it. A few of them will carry it for the rest of their lives and return to it on days when they need it and find it still there, unchanged, still holding. Epictetus was born into slavery in Hierapolis in Phrygia, a city in what is now western Turkey, sometime around the year 50 of the Common Era. He came to Rome as a slave in the household of Epaphroditus, a man who served as a secretary to the Emperor Nero. He had no governance over his body, his location, his labor, or his time. These were the conditions of his life for its first decades, and they were not gentle conditions. What he could govern was the part of himself that received those conditions, the part that looked at them and chose, moment by moment, whether they would constitute the whole of him. This discovery, made not in a library, not in a lecture hall, but in the daily necessity of surviving circumstances he could not alter, gave his philosophy a quality that no amount of academic training could have produced. He was not arguing from first principles. He was reporting from experience. He had found something that held under genuine pressure, and what he taught in that plain classroom in Nicopolis was not a position he had reasoned himself into, but a practice he had lived himself through. The Enchiridion, the handbook his student Arian compiled from his lectures, opens with a distinction so simple and so complete that almost everything else the Stoics said about anger can be derived from it. Some things are up to us, it begins, and some things are not. What is up to us? Our judgments, our impulses, what we desire, what we are averse to. What is not up to us? Our bodies, our reputations, our property, what other people do. This is the foundational line, not a comfort. A map. On one side of the line, the philosopher has absolute sovereignty. On the other side, sovereignty is an illusion, and the pursuit of it a source of endless suffering. Anger, Epictetus points out, always involves crossing that line, reaching out from the territory of the self into the territory of what cannot be controlled, and treating events there as though they constituted genuine harm. The crossing is the mistake. The philosophy is the practice of learning, slowly and repeatedly, to stay on the right side of the boundary. Anger, on this account, begins with a false belief about geography, about where one's true holdings are located. The man who flies into rage when he is insulted in public has decided, without examining the decision, that his reputation belongs to him the way his judgment belongs to him, that an attack on one is as real as an attack on the other, that the words of another person can reach across the boundary and damage something essential. Epictetus does not say this never hurts. He says the hurt, when it comes, is generated from the inside. The insult arrives. It is in itself an event in the world, external, beyond the boundary, not truly ours. What transforms it into a wound is our assent. The moment we agree that it has reached something real, we have done the damage ourselves, with our own faculty of judgment, turning a tool of liberation into a source of pain. The word for that faculty is prohairesis. It is Epictetus's central contribution to the tradition, his sharpest tool, the concept around which everything else in his teaching is organized. Prohairesis is usually translated as moral choice, or rational will, or the faculty of intention, but those translations make it sound more abstract than it is. For Epictetus, prohairesis is not a category in a philosophical taxonomy. It is a specific, present, moment-by-moment activity, the ongoing act of the self, choosing how to meet what comes. It operates continuously, mostly below awareness, assenting to some impressions and declining others, shaping the inner life through thousands of small decisions that most people never notice they are making. The philosopher who has understood prohairesis has understood that these decisions are always happening and that they are always his to make. The philosopher who has not understood it is, in Epictetus's view, not really living at all, being lived, instead, by a sequence of reactions to which he has contributed nothing but his passive assent. Anger is a misuse of prohairesis, not a failure of prohairesis. The faculty is always operating, but a direction of it toward the wrong objects, a surrendering of it to impressions that have not been examined. When the impression arrives that someone has wronged us, prohairesis is already at work, already processing it, already moving toward either assent or refusal. The ordinary, untrained response is assent. Of course this is a wrong. Of course it damages something real. Of course the anger that follows is proportionate and justified. The philosopher's response is to pause at that threshold, to look at the impression before agreeing to it, to ask what exactly is being claimed, that something belonging to me has been damaged, and then to ask the prior question, does it actually belong to me, in the sense that my judgment and my choices belong to me, or does it fall on the other side of the line? Epictetus developed this into a specific exercise for dealing with insults, one that his students practiced in and out of the classroom. When an insult arrives, the trained response is not to counter it, not to suppress the reaction, not to reason one's way to forgiveness. The trained response is a redirection of attention away from the content of what has been said, away from the question of whether it is fair or unfair, and toward the category of the thing being attacked. Someone has spoken disparagingly of one's reputation. Very well. Reputation is an external. It lies outside the boundary. It is not truly ours in the philosophically operative sense. The attack lands on something that was never ours to defend, and the pain of it, if we feel pain, is a signal that we have been confusing our holdings again, have been reaching beyond the line, and treating what is over there as though it were over here. This is not indifference. That distinction matters, and Epictetus is careful about it. The exercise is not designed to produce a man who cares about nothing. It is designed to produce a man who cares accurately, who has located the things worth caring about, and distinguished them from the things that cannot, in the final analysis, touch what is central. Epictetus cared enormously. He cared about his students. He cared about philosophy. He cared about the quality of the choices being made, moment to moment, in the faculty of prohairesis. What he did not do was extend that care outward, beyond its proper territory, into the region where the world's events occur, and where the world's events, for all their noise and force, remain finally external to the self. In the classroom in Nicopolis, Epictetus once asked a student who had just reported that someone had spoken badly of him, "And what virtues does this person possess?" The question arrived without drama, without performance of wisdom. It was a genuine philosophical redirect, not a way of dismissing the student's distress, but a way of relocating the weight of the response, placing it not on the content of what had been said, but on the authority of the one who had said it. If a man who lacks virtue and wisdom judges me, his judgment does not touch my virtue or my wisdom. It touches only the reputation, which was always outside the line. The student could feel angry, or he could feel curious. He could ask what false belief about the good has led this person to this verdict. He could feel, not the heat of wounded pride, but the cooler, more spacious response of someone who has not been reached. The question about what virtues a person possesses is not cruelty. It is not a dismissal of the student's experience. It is Epictetus's way of handing the student the tool. Here, he is saying, is where to look. Not at what was said, but at who said it, and from what understanding, and with what relationship to truth. The philosopher who has trained this redirection long enough finds that it operates gradually, before the anger has time to consolidate, that the pause between impression and assent becomes, with practice, a natural interval rather than a willed effort, and that in that interval the question arrives on its own. Does this reach what is truly mine? There is an account recorded by later authors, the details uncertain in the way that biographical details from antiquity are always uncertain, of Epictetus's master Epaphroditus twisting his leg. The story goes that Epictetus said, quietly, that if this continued, the leg would break. It broke. Epictetus said, "Did I not tell you it would break?" He said it without urgency. The point is not the specific event, which may be as much legend as history. The point is what the story was trying to say about him, that the part of him which remained sovereign was not performing sovereignty, was not achieving it through effort or suppression, but simply was it because that part of him had been so thoroughly separated from the things the world could reach, that what the world reached no longer constituted a threat to the self that mattered. This is not a comfortable idea to sit with. It asks something very large, but it asks it quietly, without urgency, in the way that all of Epictetus's philosophy asks things, as a question about where one has located one's own life. The Stoics had a technical term for the impressions that arrive before any response is formulated. They called them phantasia, appearances, or representations. Every conscious moment is full of them: a face in a crowd, a tone of voice, the memory of something said last week, the perception that someone has looked at us with contempt. Each phantasia arrives carrying already embedded in it a kind of proposal, a claim about what it means, what its value is, what it demands from us. And the extraordinary thing, which most people never notice, is that this proposal is not the phantasia itself. The phantasia is just the appearance. The proposal is something added by the mind, and added so quickly and habitually that it feels inseparable from the appearance that carried it. Epictetus called the moment of accepting or declining that proposal synchetathesis, assent, the giving of assent, or the withholding of it. This is where anger actually begins, not with the insult, not with the contemptuous look. Those are just phantasia, events in the world that arrive at the threshold of the self. Anger begins with the assent. Yes, I agree that this constitutes harm. Yes, I agree that something genuinely mine has been touched. Yes, I endorse the judgment that retaliation or defense is now appropriate. Without the assent, the phantasia passes. With it, the passion follows, and once the passion has been endorsed with the full weight of the self's agreement, it becomes very much harder to examine. This is why the crucial moment for Epictetus is always before the anger has formed itself into a clear decision, before the synchetathesis has hardened into conviction. In that brief interval between the arrival of the impression and the granting of assent, the whole transaction is still open, still examinable, still something the philosopher can meet, not with suppression, not with the clenched effort of refusing to feel, but with a genuine, unhurried question. What is this appearance claiming? Is the claim true? Does the thing it says has been damaged actually belong in the proper sense to the self? Practiced over time, this examination changes its texture, the effort required decreases, the interval widens. What began as a deliberate pause becomes something more like a natural hesitation, a built-in slowness at the threshold that allows assessment before assent, so that the passions, when they form from accurate beliefs rather than false ones. The goal is not a man who never feels anything. The goal is a man whose feelings follow genuinely from the way things are. Epictetus was eventually freed. The details of his manumission are not clearly recorded. What is clear is that after his freedom, he went first to Rome and studied philosophy there, and then, after the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome around 93 CE, he went to Nicopolis and founded his school. He taught there for decades. He lived simply. He owned famously very little. There is a story that he kept an earthenware lamp. He had once owned a beautiful iron lamp that was stolen and replaced it with earthenware deliberately, on the grounds that a man whose equanimity depends on the quality of his lamp has located his equanimity in the wrong place. The story may be embellished. The principle it encodes is not embellished at all. It is exactly what he taught. The question is always where one has located the things one depends on. If they are located outside the line, the world will eventually take them. If they are located inside, the world has nothing to reach. His students recorded what he said in lectures, and Arrian compiled those records into two works, the Discourses, 4 books of which survive from an original 8, and the Enchiridion, the compact handbook of principles. Reading them now, across 19 centuries, they have the quality of a voice still in the room. The directness is remarkable. Epictetus does not write like a man who has achieved serenity and is now dispensing it from a safe distance. He writes like a man who has found something true under genuine pressure and is passing it on with the urgency of someone who has checked the thing thoroughly and found it holds. What he found holds is this, that the self, properly understood, is located in a region the world cannot reach. Not because the world is without power. He knew exactly how much power the world had, but because the relevant self, the one that constitutes the philosopher's actual life, is the faculty of choice, and not the body, reputation, or property that the world can and routinely does reach. Anger reaches into that faculty only through our permission, only through the assent we give to the impression that something genuinely ours has been taken. Withdraw the assent, not by force, not by denial, but by genuinely examining whether the claim is true, and the anger does not suppress itself, it simply fails to find its ground. This is a long practice. Epictetus never suggests it is otherwise. The students in Nicopolis were not being shown a technique for this afternoon. They were being offered an orientation for a life. The Discourses are full of moments where he catches them, catches the students, confusing the map with the territory, locating their peace in things outside the line, and then being surprised when those things are moved or taken. He is not impatient with them. He asks the same questions repeatedly in different configurations, because the same confusions return repeatedly in different configurations. This is not evidence that the philosophy fails. It is evidence that the philosophy is a practice, not a possession. It is not something that, once understood, releases the philosopher from further effort. It is something that, understood, changes the nature of the effort, makes it internal, makes it continuous, makes it available at any moment, because it operates on precisely the one thing that is always present. The relationship between prohäresis and anger is, at its most direct, a relationship between sovereignty and error. When anger forms, prohäresis has made a mistake, has extended its care beyond its proper boundary, has endorsed a false claim about what belongs to the self, has given its assent to a proposition that a more careful examination would have declined. The philosopher's task is not to punish the faculty for its error. It is to bring it back to its proper territory, again and again, with the patience that any long practice requires. The error is not moral failure. It is philosophical confusion, the same confusion Epictetus saw everywhere around him and had learned, through necessity, to see through. There is something in Epictetus's account of anger that makes it feel very different from accounts in which anger is treated as an external force that sweeps in and overwhelms the rational self. For Epictetus, anger is not something that happens to us. It is something we do, something assembled, piece by piece, from an initial impression, a habitual assent, a false belief about where our genuine holdings are located. This does not make it easier to avoid in the moment. The assent happens very fast, and the habits that drive it are very old. But it changes what the work of avoiding it looks like. The work is not the suppression of something external. It is the examination of something internal. It is the returning, over and over, to the question of where one has placed one's life. Epictetus taught his students to do this examination, not occasionally, but continuously, not as a crisis response, not pulling out the philosophy when provoked, but as the ongoing texture of a reflective life. The examination runs all the time, quietly, below the level of drama, in the natural hesitation that develops with practice at the threshold between impression and assent. A student who has lived with this long enough carries it not as a technique, but as a temperament. The pause is not willed. It arrives on its own, like a faculty that has been exercised long enough to know its own function. In the classroom in Nicopolis, there were always students who found the philosophy too stark, who felt that the radical division between what is ours and what is not ours required them to care about nothing. Epictetus would redirect them. Care, he would say, is not the problem. The problem is the object of care. Care about what you can govern, with the full weight of your attention and your effort. Care about your judgments. Care about the quality of your responses. Care about whether you are using prohaeris well. These things are genuinely yours. They are worth the full force of your concern. What is not worth that concern is the external world's arrangement of your circumstances, the reputation, the property, what other people think and say and do. Not because these things do not matter in any register, but because they lie in a region where your care cannot, ultimately, govern what happens. And care invested in a region where it cannot govern anything is not care at all. It is anxiety wearing the costume of care. The insult is, in the end, the simplest case. Someone says something designed to diminish. The impression arrives carrying its embedded proposal. Here is evidence that something belonging to you has been attacked. Here is cause for anger. The trained philosopher meets this proposal at the threshold, looks at it carefully, asks what exactly has been attacked. A reputation, and to whom does a reputation belong in the philosophically serious sense? It belongs to the assessment of others, which is, definitionally, on the other side of the line. The attack has landed on something that was always external. The anger that was assembling itself has at the moment of clear examination lost its object, not been suppressed, not been redirected, through will, simply found, when it looked for the thing it was responding to, that the thing is not where it appeared to be. This is not comfort, or not only comfort, it is something harder and more durable than comfort. It is a reorientation of the self's understanding of where the self lives. And that reorientation, practiced across years, changes the landscape of experience in a way that Epictetus thought was genuinely available, not just to sages and philosophical thought experiments, but to any person willing to do the patient, daily, undramatic work of attending to their own faculty of choice. The lamp he carried after his stolen iron one broke is the image to hold, earthenware, replaceable, chosen not with resignation, but with clarity, with the understanding of a man who has located his life correctly, and who therefore does not need his lamp to be anything other than a lamp. He can care for it, use it, even in his way, appreciate it. What he cannot do is treat it as something whose loss would reach the part of him that matters, because that part of him is not where the lamp is. That part of him is somewhere the world has never found, and cannot reach, and has no jurisdiction over, regardless of what it takes and what it leaves. The students in Nicopolis came back to the classroom each morning. The questions that Epictetus asked them were always, in one form or another, the same question, not because he had run out of things to say, but because the question at the center of his philosophy, like the philosophy itself, does not wear out. It deepens with repetition. What is yours and what is not? Where have you placed your life, and is it safe there? The impression has arrived at the threshold, carrying its claim. Before the assent is given, before the anger has been assembled and endorsed, there is a pause, a small, unhurried sovereign pause, in which the philosopher stands at the threshold of their own response and looks carefully at what has been proposed. That pause, practiced long enough, becomes the natural shape of a free mind, not rigid, not cold, not indifferent to the world's arrivals, but unhurried in its meeting of them, spacious enough to examine before it assents, secure enough in its own location to look at the external world's claims with curiosity rather than alarm, with the steady attention of someone who knows, from long practice and from the particular quality of their own experience, exactly where the boundary is, and who has learned to live, very quietly and without drama, on the right side of it. The room in Nicopolis empties. The students leave and carry the question back into the day, into households where difficult things wait, into streets where insults and small humiliations circulate, into lives where the external world will continue, reliably, to produce events that propose themselves as causes for anger. And they carry with them, if the morning went well, not an answer to all of that, but a practice, a returning, a way of meeting the impression before the assent is given, a knowledge of where the threshold is, and what it means to stand at it with full attention, and what is possible in that small space of pause, that ordinary, undramatic, endlessly available interval between the world's arrival and the self's reply, in which the sovereignty of the rational faculty is not achieved, but simply, quietly recognized. Quintus Sextius was sitting in a room in Rome at the end of a day, in the years just before the common era turned. The room would have been quiet by then, the last of the evening light gone, the noise of the city settling into its lower register of distant carts, and the occasional voice carried on cooler air. He was not punishing himself. That is the first thing to understand about what he was doing. He sat in the composed, unhurried posture of a man who had done this long enough to know that the sitting itself was the beginning of the work, and the work was not accusation, but inquiry, the patient, honest review of a day already finished, already beyond alteration, available now only for understanding. Seneca would later describe this practice in writing, crediting Sextius with a precision and gratitude that made clear it had changed something for him. The method was simple: 3 questions, asked in order, without haste. What bad habit did you address today? What vice did you resist? In what way are you better? And the asking was not confession. It was not the voice of a prosecutor reading charges. It was the voice of a judge conducting a fair hearing, one who arrived at the bench without prejudice, genuinely open to what the evidence would show. Sextius had learned that the examined day was already, in the asking of these questions, a better day than it had been. The asking was itself a form of the answer. The 3rd question carried its own particular weight when applied to anger. In what way are you better? Not, were you angry? Not, did you fail? But the gentle forward lean of the inquiry. Where did something shift even slightly, even almost imperceptibly, in the direction of greater understanding, greater steadiness, greater freedom from the reactions that had arrived without invitation and departed leaving damage behind them? Sextius had noticed that anger asked this question of with patience rather than contempt, tended to yield more than anger, interrogated harshly. There was a particular irony in approaching anger with anger. The philosopher who condemned himself for his temper was not practicing equanimity. He was practicing a more private form of the same error. Seneca had sat with these 3 questions for many years by the time he wrote about them. He had applied them to his own days that were, by the standards of most lives, extraordinarily complicated, lived in proximity to power in ways that gave the passions constant material to work with. And what he found, he wrote, was that the quality of sleep available to a person who had spent the evening in this kind of honest review was different in kind from the sleep of the person who had simply collapsed under the weight of the day. The mind that had nothing unexamined, waiting for it in the dark, rested differently, not more dramatically, not with any sudden relief, but with the particular stillness of a room from which all unnecessary things have been quietly removed, a stillness that had space in it, that breathed. He wrote this not as instruction alone, but as testimony. He was describing something he knew from experience, which gave the description a quality that the purely prescriptive passages in his work did not always have. There was a restraint in it, a man reporting what he had found, not requiring the reader to find the same thing, but offering the report with the quiet confidence of someone who had tested the claim enough times to no longer need to argue for it. The practice Sextius and Seneca were describing had a particular application to anger, because anger, more than almost any other passion, tends to grow in the dark. Unexamined, the grievances of the day do not dissolve during sleep. They consolidate. They find each other, arrange themselves into patterns, acquire the weight of accumulated evidence. The insult of the morning joins the slight of the afternoon, and by the time they have spent the night together, they have become something that feels less like a recent event and more like a permanent condition of the world. This was not a psychological observation Seneca made tentatively. He stated it plainly. Do not carry anger across the threshold of sleep, not because sleep has the power to cure what waking left unexamined, but precisely because it does not. The night is a philosophical boundary. Before crossing it, the day's angers must be met honestly, found in their causes, measured against the actual scale of what was lost and released. To release them required first finding what was actually holding them, and what was holding them was never the event itself. It was the judgment attached to the event, the judgment that something of genuine value had been damaged, the judgment that the person who caused the damage had done so in a way that called for a proportionate response. These judgments had the feeling of certainty about them in the moment of their formation. They arrived already dressed in the authority of the obvious, but examined in the quiet of an evening, with Sextius's 3 questions providing the structure, they tended to lose that authority gradually, the way the quality of light changes in a room as evening deepens, without any single moment of transition. This was the movement Seneca was tracking, the incremental cooling, the slow relinquishment of heat, not a dramatic philosophical conversion, not the sudden recognition of a truth, just the patient revisiting of the judgment that had generated the heat and the gentle discovery that the judgment looked at honestly did not quite hold. Marcus Aurelius had a different version of this same evening work, though it pointed toward the same destination by a different path, where Sextius and Seneca worked through the specific incidents of the day, locating the judgment, examining it, releasing it. Marcus tended to work through scale. He would expand the frame, begin with the specific irritation, the specific person, the specific grievance, and then slowly, without forcing anything, widen the perspective until the specific was held within something vastly larger, not to make it meaningless, but to make it proportionate. He had described this practice in his notebook in terms that were characteristically unsentimental. The meditation on time, the contemplation of how briefly the individual life persisted against the sweep of history, how briefly history itself persisted against the duration of the cosmos, was not an exercise in despair. It was an exercise in proportion. The court official who had been contemptuous, the judgment that had gone unheeded, the day's particular harvest of petty injustice and frustration. Marcus would hold these things in memory and then quietly, deliberately begin to expand the temporal frame around them. The generations that had lived before, the generations that would come after, the emperors and generals and philosophers who had held their positions in the world with complete conviction of their own importance and had now dissolved entirely into the undifferentiated past. Among those who had dissolved were people who had been angry, who had held their grievances with absolute certainty of their legitimacy, who had retaliated or nursed their resentments or constructed elaborate mental cases for why the treatment they had received was unacceptable. And all of that, the anger, the retaliation, the carefully maintained sense of injury, had passed through time and left no trace. The same time was waiting patiently for Marcus himself, for his court officials, for everyone currently producing the material that the day's meditations were made from. This contemplation did not produce indifference. Marcus was explicit about that. The philosopher who used the view from above to escape the requirements of justice or to abandon care for the people and situations in his governance had misunderstood the exercise. The point was not to make the world small and therefore ignorable. The point was to make the specific grievance proportionate, to locate it accurately within the full scale of what was actually happening, so that the response could be calibrated not to the heat of the moment, but to the genuine weight of the matter. Anger inflates. The view from above deflates the inflation without deflating the underlying concern. In the evening hours when Marcus used this practice, it had the quality of a slow release. The day's irritations rising in memory, vivid, particular, still carrying some residual warmth, and then, as the frame expanded, beginning to lose their specific heat, not disappearing, not being dismissed, but finding their actual size, which was almost always smaller than they had felt in the moment of their occurrence. The anger of the afternoon, encountered again in the evening's expanding contemplation, tended to become something closer to a note in a longer composition than a crisis requiring urgent resolution. There was a practice that sat beside the temporal expansion and worked in a different register, not scale, but understanding. Marcus had returned to it again and again in his notebook, in different formulations, with what looks from the outside like a man reminding himself of something he knew perfectly well and kept forgetting. The reminder was this: the person who had done the thing that generated the anger had not done it freely. They had done it from ignorance, not the performance of ignorance, not the pretense of ignorance offered as an excuse, but genuine ignorance of what was actually good, genuine false belief about what would benefit them or the world. They had aimed at something they believed was worth having, using a map of value that was inaccurate. The result had been harmful, but the intent, in the philosophical sense, had been toward what they mistakenly understood as the good. This was not an original insight. Marcus had inherited it from Socrates through Epictetus, and he knew it was inherited. What he was doing in his notebook was not discovery, but practice, the repeated application of an understanding he had held for years to the specific material the day kept providing. Each new provocation offered another opportunity to ask not how dare they, but what false belief about the good has led this person here. And the asking of that question, genuinely rather than rhetorically, did something particular to the anger. It turned the angry person into a subject of philosophical attention rather than a target of moral condemnation. It did not excuse the harm. It located the harm in a more accurate causal story. And the more accurate story was, in a quiet way, more releasing, than the simpler one that anger tended to tell. Marcus would not always have succeeded at this. The notebook is honest about failure, about the same patterns returning, the same admonishments repeated across weeks and months. The man at his writing table in a military tent telling himself what he already knew and having to tell himself again tomorrow. But the practice was not invalidated by imperfect performance. The point of returning to the same understanding each evening was precisely that return was always possible. The day had been difficult, the equanimity had frayed, the anger had risen, and perhaps in some cases prevailed. And then, in the quiet of the evening, the notebook was opened, and the work began again, unhurried, without condemnation, from wherever the day had ended. Seneca had issued the specific injunction clearly, writing it without qualification. Do not go to sleep while still angry. He was not speaking of the biochemistry of emotion or the physiology of rest, though both would have been relevant to his point. He was speaking philosophically. Unresolved anger is not a problem of the night. It is a problem of the mind that carries it into the night, having refused or simply failed to do the work of examining it. The night offers a kind of philosophical deadline. It is the limit of the day. What cannot be examined tonight will not be examined in the interval of sleep. Sleep has no interest in philosophical work, offers no insight, performs no healing that the waking mind has not already begun. Sleep simply preserves what it receives. This was, in the Stoic understanding, connected to something deeper. The philosophers of the Stoa had a way of thinking about sleep that gave the practice of the evening review a particular gravity. Sleep, they understood, bore a family resemblance to the other great release, the final one. To move each night from waking into sleep was to practice, in a minor key, the relinquishment of consciousness that would someday be final. Marcus had drawn this parallel explicitly in his notebook, not with dread, but with the equanimity of a man who had thought carefully about both states and found that contemplating their relationship was steadying rather than destabilizing. What we release each night when we sleep, the concerns of the day, the ongoing narrative of the self, the accumulated grievances and hopes and projects, we release completely in the other kind of sleep that awaits. Was made the practice of releasing anger before sleep something more than good psychology. It was a rehearsal for a larger letting go. And what the Stoics noticed was that people who practiced this rehearsal, who developed the habit, night after night, of examining the day honestly and releasing what the examination showed, did not need to be held, tended to acquire, over time, a different relationship to what they had released. Not indifference, not the numbness of someone who has learned not to care, but a kind of practiced ease with impermanence. The things that had seemed so urgently important at noon had been examined and released at midnight, and had not returned in the morning in the same form, not because they had been resolved, but because they had been met, genuinely met, with the three questions of Sextius, or the expanding frame of Marcus, or the quiet examination of the judgment that Seneca prescribed. And what is genuinely met does not need to be met again with the same urgency. The Stoic view of sleep as practice for death was not a morbid fascination with endings. It was a clarifying frame. The person who practiced the nightly release of what was not truly theirs was practicing the recognition that things which feel essential to the self, grievances, victories, projects, the whole elaborate structure of what has happened and what was done to us and what is owed, are not in fact constitutive of the self in any deep sense. They are weather, they pass through, the self that lies beneath them, that looks at them with the honest, patient attention of Sextius's evening questions, is not the same thing as what it is reviewing. It is the reviewer, and the reviewer continues after the review, quiet, intact, not diminished by what it has examined and released. The practice of the evening review, applied specifically to the day's angers, had a particular texture when done with Seneca's suggested method. The philosopher moving back through the incidents of the day, not chronologically, with the urgency of someone reliving events, but gently, unhurried, the way light moves across a wall in late afternoon, the morning's frustration, the midday slight, the long grinding impatience of an afternoon that refused to go the way it had been intended. Each incident arrived in memory with some residual charge, and the practice was to stay with each one just long enough to find the judgment underneath it, the belief that something genuinely valuable had been lost or damaged, the belief that the person responsible had transgressed a genuine moral boundary, the belief that the proper response was retaliation, or at minimum, the hot satisfaction of condemnation. These beliefs had arrived in the moment of provocation with the force of self-evidence. They had not been chosen. They had presented themselves as simply the truth about what had happened, and the evening review was the space in which that self-evidence could be tested. Not aggressively, not with the aim of proving the beliefs false, but with the honest philosophical question, is this accurate? Is what was lost actually lost in the way that matters? Is the person who caused it the kind of agent whose actions can constitute a genuine harm to the part of me that is truly mine? Is the retaliation or the condemnation actually proportionate, or has the anger performed the operation it always performs and inflated the injury to a scale it does not deserve? When the question was put this way, carefully, without the background noise of the original emotional charge distorting the signal, the beliefs tended to shift, not always to their opposite, not always to the comfortable conclusion that nothing mattered, but to something more accurate, more graduated, more honest about the actual scale of what had happened and what it meant. And the shift in the belief produced a shift in the heat, not a sudden cooling, but the incremental, almost unnoticeable change in temperature that a room undergoes as evening progresses. No single moment of transition, but a genuine difference between where it started and where it ended. This was the movement the Stoics were pointing at, the slow release that came from examining what the anger was built on and finding the structure less solid than it had appeared. The grievances of the day, reviewed with philosophical patience, did not always vanish. Some of them revealed, on examination, a genuine wrong that deserved acknowledgement and response. But even those, perhaps especially those, were better met from the state of clear-eyed understanding than from the distorting heat of reactive passion. The anger that survived the evening review was not the same as the anger that had arrived at the provocation. It had been purified of its inflation, its false certainty, its pleasure and condemnation for its own sake. What remained after the review was, at most, a clear-eyed recognition of a genuine wrong, which was the beginning of wisdom rather than the beginning of trouble. The destination that all of this was oriented toward had a name in Seneca's vocabulary: tranquillitas animi, the tranquility of the soul. He had written about it directly in a separate treatise, addressing a friend who had asked him how to find relief from the particular exhaustion of a mind that lurched endlessly between agitation and numbness, between the passionate pursuit of what it wanted and the hollow disappointment that followed acquisition. Seneca's answer was not a method in the technical sense. It was more like a description of what was possible, offered with enough precision that the reader could recognize it not as a theoretical destination, but as something they had briefly touched on certain quieter evenings without quite knowing what it was. Tranquillitas animi was not serenity achieved once and held permanently, was not the philosopher's reward for having completed the work. It was more like a quality of movement, the difference between a mind that moved through its days, dragged by the current of its reactions, and a mind that had learned to move through the same currents with enough inner steadiness that the currents, however strong, did not determine the direction of travel. The tranquil mind was not a calm mind in the simple sense of a mind from which nothing disturbing ever arose. It was a mind that had developed the habit, the practiced reflex, of meeting what arose with the three questions of Sextius, or the expanding frame of Marcus, or the patient examination of the judgment that Seneca prescribed, and finding, in that meeting, that the disturbance was always smaller than it looked, always held within something more spacious than the disturbance itself. The image Seneca returned to in his letters and treatises was not architectural, not a fortress or a citadel against the passions. It was more luminous than that, more alive. He was pointing at something like the quality of a lamp burning in a room, the steadiness of the flame, not because it is protected from the air around it, but because it burns with enough consistency and warmth that ordinary drafts do not extinguish it, and what might in a weaker flame produce flickering produces in this one only the slight, natural, constant adjustments by which the flame stays itself. The tranquil philosopher was not a philosopher who felt nothing. Seneca was entirely clear on this. The goal was not the emptiness that resulted from having successfully suppressed every passion or disciplined every reaction into silence. That was not equanimity, but a kind of inner paralysis, and it was not what the Stoa had been aiming at. What it had been aiming at was the eupatheia, the well-grounded affective state that sits on the far side of the pathos, reached not by removing the soul's capacity for response, but by refining it. The capacity to feel the full weight of what is happening, the injustice, the loss, the friction of human life in its daily texture, and to feel it from a place of accurate understanding rather than distorted reaction. The Stoic sage, walking through the crowded street, did not pass through it in a state of emotional vacancy. What distinguished the sage from the person whose passions still ran to distortion was the quality of the feeling, its groundedness, its accuracy, its freedom from the inflation that unchecked passion always added to the original experience. The sage felt what was actually there, not more, not less. This was what the nightly practice was building toward. Not the absence of feeling, but the education of it. The slow, patient, evening by evening refinement of the soul's responses until they came to reflect, with increasing accuracy, what was actually present, what was actually good, what was actually lost, what actually mattered, rather than what the passions, operating under their characteristic misapprehensions about value, claimed was present. Each evening review that located a false judgment and gently released it was a small piece of this work. Each night that the day's angers were examined and brought to proportion before sleep was a small step toward the state in which proportion was no longer something that had to be achieved by effort, because it had become, gradually and without drama, the natural shape of the mind's engagement with the world. The practice was nightly because the material was daily. Human life did not run out of provocations. The street was always full of jostling. The courts were always full of injustice. The people closest to us always carried the particular capacity to produce, in us, the reactions that nothing else could quite produce. The world did not cooperate with the philosopher's aspiration toward equanimity. It offered every day fresh material for the passions to work with. But this was not a reason for despair. It was, from the Stoic point of view, the reason for the practice. If there were no provocations, there would be no occasion for philosophy. The difficulties of the day were the material from which the evening review was made, and the evening review was the laboratory in which the tranquil mind was, incrementally assembled. Quintus Sextius had understood this. Sitting in his quiet Roman room, with the evening settling around him, asking his 3 questions without urgency, he was not trying to achieve something outside himself. He was not reaching toward a state of inner peace that resided somewhere in the future, waiting for enough evenings of sufficient examination to unlock it. He was already in it. The asking of the questions was the thing. The willingness to sit at the end of the day with honest attention and patient inquiry, rather than with the suppression or avoidance that the day's angers might otherwise be given. This willingness was itself the practice, and the practice was itself the destination. Seneca, writing to his brother Novatus about the same practice that Sextius had passed down, understood that what he was recommending was not a cure in the way that a cure suggests something wrong that has been set right. It was more like the ongoing maintenance of a fire, the philosopher attending to the flame, not because the flame is in danger of going out, but because the attention itself is what keeps it burning steadily. The evening questions were the philosopher attending to the flame, not restoring it from extinction, not rescuing it from crisis, simply with the quiet, regular attention of someone who has learned what the flame requires, keeping it burning at the proper temperature through the night and into the next day and the day after that. The night that waits on the other side of this practice is not empty. It is not the blank unconsciousness of a mind that has simply run out of things to think. It is the particular fullness of a mind that has completed the day's examination, found what the examination yielded, and now releases both the findings and the day itself into the larger dark that holds them, and holds everything, and continues regardless of what it holds. The philosopher who has spent the evening with Sextius's questions, or with Marcus's expanding frame, or with the patient forensic review that Seneca describes, this philosopher does not need the night to resolve what the day left open. The day left less open than it would have. What remains is quieter, smaller, already partway dissolved in the honest light of the evening's attention. Somewhere in Rome, in the 1st century of the Common Era, Seneca put down his stylus on a night after such a practice, and felt the specific quality of rest that he would later try to describe in his letters. Not the exhaustion of a man who had worn himself out, but the settledness of one who had done what was required, and found it sufficient. The lamp was still burning. The room was quiet. The day's angers had been met and examined and brought, as much as an evening's work could bring them, to their proper size. What remained was not a problem awaiting solution. It was simply the night and the flame, and the mind resting in the understanding that had always been available to it. Steady, quiet, unhurried, asking nothing of the dark, giving light to it simply by being what it was. That light does not go out when the practice ends for the evening.